Hi, thanks to the Sciinov group for having invited me. I'm very happy to participate. The talk I propose deals with the daily intake option versus bolus doses option in the vitamin D intake in all types of contexts, but of course, especially in the purpose of reducing the Covid-19 incidence and severity, especially during the cold season. To present myself, I'm not a vitamin D referent. I'm obstetrician and gynecologist, so I'm a physician. My special interest in the vitamin D status goes back to more or less the year 2012, when I read in a paper breast cancer and vitamin D status, the relationship is established. The turning point in my prescription happened in 2016 when I saw on YouTube a slideshow by Bruce Hollis from Charleston, South Carolina, USA, which emphasizes the daily intake instead of the bolus doses intake, using quite convincing arguments. Shortly after, I had the opportunity to go further thanks to Jean-Claude Souberbiel from Paris. So since 2017, I have acquired the practical experience of around 1,000 prescriptions of vitamin D daily intake, supported in each case by the vitamin D circulating level 4 months after the beginning of the intake. This practical experience may appear to be useful in the current COVID-19 context. So the first slide shows the sources of vitamin D. The two upper images figure the influence of latitude and seasons. Of course, the spontaneous vitamin D deficiency increases as the latitude approaches the poles and as the day duration decreases because of the season. In some cold countries like Norway, the consumption of cod liver, which is rich in vitamin D3, has enabled to avoid deficiency, but could also bring too much vitamin A and also heavy metals and pollutants. In fact, depending on the seasons, the two main sources of a fine vitamin D status is the sun during summer and the pharmacologic D3 during winter. The two first-order vitamin D forms are the D3, which half-life is 24 hours, and the 25OH, which has a half-life of 3 weeks. Here is the historically first discovered role of vitamin D, the endocrine role destined to calcium and bone. 3 remarks about this slide. First, traditionally and until now, the main expert advising the health authorities about vitamin D prescription are rheumatologists and not infectious disease specialists, even in the current COVID-19 context. Second remark, the long half-life of about 3 weeks of the 25OH is due to his high affinity to vitamin D binding protein, which protects the 25OH. Thus, bolus doses are efficient in rheumatology. and thus rheumatologists are not in the better situation to renounce to the bolus doses on the basis of extra rheumatologic arguments. Third remark, the 25OH is circulating bound to vitamin D binding protein, constituting a voluminous complex that cannot enter the cells without the presence of the so-called megalincubulin system, which has practically not been found out of the kidney. Here is an overview of other vitamin D effects. On the left of the figure, an immune cell, or a lambda cell, is shown, with the two possible vitamin D forms being able to enter the D3 and the 25OH. In both cases, it is followed by the intracellular 25OH presence, and then the 125, which binds to a specific cytoplasmic receptor in order to reach the nucleus and to induce genomic effects. The vitamin D inactivation circuit is also important to take into account. The critical step is represented by the 24-hydroxylase, which appears to vary in efficiency, function of a number of subtle factors, as we shall see in the next slide. Here are the two main interpretations at this scale of the superiority of the daily intake versus the bolus doses. To my knowledge, these two interpretations have not been previously represented in a single schema. As we shall see, the two do not conflict each other, but on the contrary are admirably combined to support the daily intake superiority. This slide figures a lambda cell. Say it is an immune cell. On the left is the Hollis and Wagner interpretation, which emphasizes the D3 as playing the main role, supported by two arguments. First, D3 has a low affinity for the binding protein and thus a short half-life, but thus also it can enter freely into the cell via the concentration gradient, and it can be transformed into 25OH because the 25-hydroxylase has been detected in a number of cells. Second argument, the physiological intracellular entry of 25OH is doubtful, both because the membrane megalincubulin active transport may be absent in the lambda cell, or because of its high affinity for the binding protein, enough circulating free OH is not allowed. On the right is the Wyatt interpretation, which emphasizes two possible effects of bolus doses, stimulating the intracellular 24-hydroxylase activity and inhibiting the activity of the 21-hydroxylase. As I said earlier, these two interpretations combine admirably. Now some values which are useful to evaluate the vitamin D status. By consensus, the deficiency is characterized by a level which is inferior to 12 nanograms per milliliters. It is considered as sufficient in the general population at a level up more than 20 nanograms. But in certain cases, the target is more likely situated over 30 nanograms. The upper limit of optimal status is considered as situated from 50 to 60 nanograms, as in the Maasai populations that live in Africa with a very ancient way of life. In apparently healthy people in France in winter, about 13% are below 12 nanograms. It is usually considered as consensual that a circulating level of 25 OH is the gold standard criterion to evaluate the vitamin D status. But as we saw in the preceding slide, according to both Hollis and Wyatt interpretation, 30 nanograms level 2 weeks after a bolus dose does not mean that the vitamin D status of the immune cell is optimal. So perhaps it might be proposed that the 25 OH level is the gold standard if and only if no bolus dose is used. An excellent synthesis is just recently be published by the team of Martin Ewison. The vitamin D has the power to stimulate the innate immunity, the acquired antimicrobial immunity, but also to inhibit the acquired autoimmunity, to have an anti-inflammatory effect, to protect the superficial cells of the respiratory ways, to reduce the cytokine storm, and to protect the local renin-angiotensin system. It is interesting to note that the COVID-19 and vitamin D deficiency risk factors are quite strictly the same. Older age, clothing practices, skin pigmentation, body mass index, outdoor activities, associated pathologies, and seasons. There are many observational data that binds vitamin D and respiratory infection, including TB. For example, in the Jolliffe publication, the meta-analysis has reported significant associations between low vitamin D status and increased risk of both upper and lower respiratory tract infections. But of course, to discuss the recommendations to limit COVID-19 pandemic, the most important is the meta-analysis by Martineau in 2017. Almost 11,000 of participants were taken into consideration, and protective effects were seen in those who received daily or weekly vitamin D without additional bolus doses, but not in those receiving one or more bolus doses. Of course, protective effects were stronger in those whose baseline level was below 10 nanograms. So, unfortunately, the Martineau paper doesn't go further in considering the results of daily or weekly prescriptions separately, but I did it within the 25 eligible studies that were considered by Martineau, and as expected, the higher benefit is observed in case of daily intake versus weekly intake. So to speak of the reasons of the discordances in the results of the randomized controlled trials, of course, the number of participants, the observance rate, the posology, the kind of vitamin D used, the calcium associations or not, and the possibility or not to take external intakes of vitamin D. Of course, the daily intake or bolus doses, the baseline level, and the level reached in the vitamin D group, the initial situation from a clinical or biological point of view, and the intention to treat analysis or secondary subgroup analysis. It has been also established that vitamin D deficiency is a risk factor for COVID-19. The frequency is increased in the population with lower vitamin D level. And also, when COVID-19 is diagnosed, the average 25OH level is lower, 11 nanogram versus 24 nanograms in the W study. 2 days ago, I noticed that there were 242 PubMed references, with only one randomized controlled trial, the Castillo publication, but that has shown a positive effect, but it is not the subject here because it's a curative study and not a preventive study. Also, we will soon have news of other RCTs because in clinical trials in the site, 58 studies are referenced. What to deduce of the available data? Preventive interventional data are not yet available, but the current state of the literature incites both the prescription in the general population and the choice of daily intake. Of course, there are collateral benefits of an optimal vitamin D status. It is likely to reduce virtually any kind of pathology, cancers, cardiovascular diseases, other infections, autoimmune disease, and probably the pseudo-Kawasaki COVID-19 child form, obstetrical pathologies, renal insufficiency, diabetes, depression, etc. The consequence of these collateral benefits could be that if the COVID-19 fear inside the population to take vitamin D daily, there could be a colossal decrease of this pathology and thus a colossal economic gain, not to speak about the human benefit. So, of course, in the current second wave context, still recommending bolus doses instead of daily intakes goes against the current state of the literature. Here is our paper. The purpose of our paper is to constitute a supranational reference to influence the health authorities of countries affected by COVID-19 to recommend daily intake instead of bolus doses. Among the 14 co-authors, 10 are vitamin D well-known reference from 8 different countries, with a number of publications for each of them, especially about the interaction between vitamin D and immunity. The authors affirm that a daily intake of as much as 2,000 to 4,000 unities per day has proven to be safe, except the rare cases of vitamin D hypersensitivity, for example, sarcoidosis. Notably, it does not increase the risk of kidney stones. Nevertheless, 1,000 to 1,200 unities per day could be a good political choice, as it is enough to avoid severe deficiency for almost all the population. Before finishing, a few words about the protocol I told about in the introduction. We call this protocol Clé de Sol. It's a musical word game in French language because Clay means K, D means vitamin D, and Sol means both the note Sol, the musical note Sol, and le soleil, the sun. Just these days, I'm soliciting the authorizations to begin the official arm of the protocol and to publish the next 1,000 cases of coupling the prescription adapted to each case and the 25 OH level obtained 4 months after the autumnal beginning of the intake. So, the chosen target in routine is obtaining 30 nanograms, but in pathologic antecedent like cancer or evolutive autoimmune disease, it is 35. In case of pregnant women, we chose 25 nanogram as a target. Of note, since its beginning 3 years ago, the only significant update in our protocol is a reduction of the pathology during pregnancy, diverging with Bruce Hollis' indication. With the kind of pathology he advises, it seems that we observe some insolite hypercalcemia in some neonates with low birth weight. So, since 3 years and a half, around 1,000 cases were managed, and the posology was each time adapted according to the 25 OH level after 4 months of autumnal beginning of the intake. If somebody is interested, I can share by email the complete current Excel file of this protocol in order to build on a multicentric study project. So, before finishing, I have to thank especially Jean-Claude Berbiel from Paris, Bruce Hollis from Charleston, South Carolina, USA, and Fabrice Julia, which is my collaborator of all my publications and research works since many years. So thanks for watching. The questions are welcome.